Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Melanie Carminati, and you are tuning into the Know and Do Better podcast, where we chat with experts on a variety of different health, wellness, and holistic topics. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Rachel Fine, who is a registered dietitian nutritionist and creator of The Healthy Dancer. Hello, Rachel. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited for us to chat today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to give you as much insight as I can.
So for those who do not know, Rachel is a registered dietitian nutritionist, as I mentioned, and creator of The Healthy Dancer. Rachel founded To The Pointe Nutrition in 2013 with the mission to provide certified nutrition education to dancers of all ages and levels. As a certified specialist in sports nutrition and certified counselor of intuitive eating, Rachel combines her expertise in performance nutrition with a non-diet approach to eating. With a master's degree in clinical nutrition and dietetics from NYU, Rachel completed her dietetic internship at NYU Langone Medical Center and at the Mount Sinai Hospital, after which she joined the staff at NYU Langone Medical Center as a clinical dietitian and worked as NYU's clinical adjunct co-instructor for medical nutrition. Rachel's experience among populations in the performing arts stems further with research at NYU Langone's Harkness Center for Dance Injuries and appointment of adjunct professor of sports nutrition at LIU Post. Rachel is also a 2019 and 2020 nominee for the Dance Educators Award, presented from the International Association for Dance Medicine and Science. So Rachel, I wanted to start off the conversation with just chatting about how COVID-19, the pandemic itself, has affected daily nutrition for most individuals. What have you seen?
Great question. With so many individuals that I work with, they tend to fall under that realm of being somewhat type A, somewhat perfectionist, people that kind of like to be in control. And when we had the pandemic hit us about a year ago, or already over a year ago, which is insane to think about, so much was out of our control. Knowing when we were going to get back into studios, knowing when we were going to get back any bit of normalcy, which for many people still has not returned to normalcy. All of those unknowns were so out of our immediate control that what we saw are what I saw a lot of dancers who I work with really falling into some disordered eating habits because one thing they could control was their food intake and their body weight. So what did I see most change, or what shifts did I see most with COVID-19? Was just a major influx of disordered eating. And obviously it's already rampant in the performing arts world. So now seeing this influx was just pretty eye-opening because it really just shows how much education needs to be done for this population in regards to knowing that it's okay to not have full control over every aspect of life, and knowing how to navigate that loss of control without having to turn to other factors and without having to turn to unsustainable habits around other aspects of our lives, like feeding ourselves and what our body looks like.
Would you say that one of the challenges for the dance population was shifting from the nutrition necessary for performance season or like regular performance, and then going to COVID and there being like halt in their normal routine? Did you see that there was a difficulty with that transitioning, how they were managing their nutrition, their dietary or caloric intake, output, energy in, energy out?
Yeah, there was a major fear that started to take place with dancers in regards to knowing that their schedules took a major hit. And even the dancers that, there was about a time in the very beginning of quarantine when studios just really had no idea what to do. So they hadn't really yet picked up the idea of virtual training. So you had a good month where dancers really weren't even dancing. They went from dancing 7-hour days to not dancing at all. And there was a major fear, not just a fear of, am I going to lose everything that I've worked for in regards to my endurance and my strength, but there was a fear of weight gain. And this idea of, I just went from 7 hours in the studio dancing to now sitting at home, not doing much. What do I do about my food intake? And this really fueled the hurricane of that influx of disordered eating that I saw between the months of, I would say, March to August, and even still trickling in as late as now. But a major fear of low levels of activity or lower levels of activity than what most of the dancers are usually used to. A fear of, how do I feel myself? How do I feel myself now that I'm not dancing? And we can obviously get to my suggestions for that. But in overall, what did I see? Well, it was just an overwhelming fear of dancers needing to find control in their eating habit, but then scared of what's going to happen to my body now that I'm not dancing enough. And how can I turn to food to make sure whatever could happen doesn't happen?
I have one larger umbrella question followed by a smaller question, which you'll go into more steps about, I'm sure. So, umbrella question, what is the key to healthy nutrition for dancers? And then how do you work with these dancers to achieve healthful eating behaviors and habits?
Yeah. So, in this general umbrella term of what I call, what is dance nutrition, we are incorporating so many different principles. The first and foremost thing is that dancers are athletes. They're artists, but their nutritional needs are comparable to athletes, and therefore they're higher than that of the regular or the standard population. Because of that, we need a bit more of a proactive approach to planning a dancer's performance nutrition needs. This generally involves a proactive approach to planning their meals and planning their snacks and making sure that they are balanced. And when I say balance, what goes into this idea of performance nutrition is making sure that there's a source of the macronutrients. So this is carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And a dancer's body requires all three of these macronutrients in order to function optimally. This is really taking into account the principles of sports nutrition. Now, in regards to a dancer, though, my big movement into the dance world is also factoring the idea of intuitive eating and intuitive nutrition and teaching dancers that they can have these goals of performance nutrition and sports nutrition and really optimizing their meals in order to optimize their performance. They can do that, but they shouldn't restrict themselves. They should still be enjoying foods just because it's food. And I know that there are a lot of negative connotations in the dance world when it comes to food and certain indulgent foods like desserts, sweets. There's a lot of fear mongering around these types of foods, not just from diet culture of the general public, but it's accentuated in the dance world because unfortunately the dance world just has these antiquated ideals that need to go out the window, and we're trying to make that happen, but it's going to take a lot of time. So it's a matter of teaching dancers that they need to fuel their body using the principles of sports nutrition and taking that proactive approach, but doing so in a non-restrictive way and tuning into their intuitive feelings of fullness and satisfaction and honoring their hunger, honoring their body's needs and learning how to listen to those needs. So it's really this balance of performance nutrition and intuitive nutrition.
In addition to that balance, or when you're working with all dancers, do you find that there are a few who have eating habits that don't necessarily fall into disordered eating? Do you occasionally get dancers who just want general nutrition and like sports performance? Does that happen? Or would you say majority do have disordered habits when they're coming to you?
I like this question because it's not one that I get often. I think that the dance world is so knee deep in disordered eating and eating disorders that it's not that often we talk about the dancers that don't struggle with these issues.
Right.
But I will say I do get a lot of dancers that don't struggle with disordered eating and a lot of dancers that just want the education. They just want nutrition education. And that's a great thing because it's also one of the steps in knowing how to prevent diet culture from impacting a dancer. So I will meet, with dancers of all ages. Sometimes on the younger spectrum, they're really just needing this education. And if a dancer who is younger, let's say necessarily younger than 15 years old. Let's say that dancer is coming to me with a bit of disordered eating or a bit on that spectrum of disordered eating. Usually it is just a lack of education. It's just going onto Google, reading an article about, let's just say, quote unquote, the keto diet, and that dancer being like, oh, I read this article, this actress is doing it, let me do keto. They're not
Mm,
necessarily turning to disordered eating behaviors because of any deep down issue,
psychological, yeah.
psychological issue. It's more of just literally a lack of education.
Mm,
So I try and do everything in my power. That's what I do over on my blog at dancenutrition.com. It's just give education so that 11, 12, 13-year-old dancer who's Googling how many calories should a dancer eat in a day will, hopefully find my article instead of some other publication out there that's recommending a disordered type of behavior around food, and at least spark the interest of taking a wholesome, non restrictive approach to how they're going to fuel their body.
wonderful. That's really positive to hear that there are dancers who are just wanting to come to you for that increase in knowledge and to better themselves overall for their performance career. So that's really positive.
Absolutely.
When you are working with individuals who do have eating disorders or disordered eating behaviors, which other health professionals are you also working with when you're working with these individuals? Because eating habits is one thing, but like you said, it stems from a deeper psychological issue that needs to be addressed.
So, always when that's the case, I am referring and most often requiring that dancers work alongside a mental health therapist.
Mhm.
This is because it really does take an interdisciplinary approach to not just learning how to fuel the body, but learning how to combat so many negative situations that we do have as artistic athletes. So, for example, the triggers of body image. This is a big thing. Competition in the dance world, body image competition. There's a lot of social stigmas that dancers have to deal with, and knowing how to build a toolbox against them and how to navigate them is so important for the sustainability of a dancer's career. It can so easily, if a dancer is triggered by a certain comment, we can't necessarily control that these comments are going to happen, but what we can control is our response to them and learning how to respond to them, building that toolbox. And that's where this interdisciplinary approach of a dietitian and a therapist, and then of course there's other disciplines that might come into play here, with even with injury prevention, a physical therapist, an occupational therapist. There's a bunch of different routes. I am also generally referring to a physical therapist if a dancer is struggling with the strength and endurance needed to work in a healthy manner rather than subjecting their body to any unhealthy types of movements and cross training.
Mhm.
So that's another interdisciplinary approach that is sometimes taken just in order to make sure that this dancer is really building a whole approach to their practice.
What would you say the keys are for lifelong carryover
What do you mean by lifelong carryover?
with the nutrition education, the habit, the retraining? What are some keys and like tools that you might give for that carryover?
Sure. In regards to nutrition, it's really building a plan that nourishes the body, taking into account consistency and balance. So, consistency means that we're, again, having that proactive approach and planning ahead so that a dancer is not going long hours in between meals and snacks that can risk their energy levels, their mental clarity, and of course, risk injury down the road. Having this proactive plan where they're packing balanced snacks for their day, or they're planning around the potential for late meals, long rehearsals, is so important for the sustainability of their career, just as a means of injury prevention and making sure that their body is getting in enough. A lot of dancers will either intentionally or unintentionally undereat throughout the day. And this could be because of disordered eating, or this could even just be because of a busy schedule. We see dancers undereat. So it doesn't necessarily have to be this intentional restrictive diet that's causing them to undereat. It could literally just be that they are just going from academic classes to rehearsals to a late night performance. It takes a bit of planning, but not obsessive planning.
Mm,
We also want to make sure a dancer is not falling into this idea that they can only eat the foods they pack and that they can't handle spontaneous situations around food. These are also important tactics, making sure a dancer is building a nourishing lifestyle, but not an obsessive lifestyle when
mm,
it comes to to knowing how to take performance nutrition and fuel the body.
Great. So I feel like those tools can also be used for non-dancers when combating toxic diet culture that's out there too.
Absolutely. And it's so easy for any of us to take nutrition information and twist it into diet culture mandates and rules. For example, we know that protein is going to help us stay full and help us build muscle.
Mhm.
But diet culture will turn that into high protein meal to build muscle and, make you succeed as a dancer. But, so we need to take that a step down, take a step back and say, okay, well, let's first pair our protein with a source of carbohydrate and a source of fat. All three of these macronutrients are going to hold a place in our body and hold a place in our performance. Let's not do it in an obsessive way. Let's choose foods that we like, that are going to satisfy us, that are going to make us happy, and not choose foods just because we think we should be eating them, just because they're quote unquote healthy or good. When we give these labels to foods like health or good or versus
Mhm.
bad, that imposes restrictions in of itself, which at the end of the road will lead us to just unsustainable habits around food.
So there's so many diet out there, Atkins, keto. Is there ever a time when these are safe and healthy to do? And do you work with your clients to implement these diets into their life or?
It's a good question. There are a lot of diets out there. I mean, we could spend, it's a whole podcast in of itself, diet culture and the types of diets out there. And the truth is, I don't support most of them. If a dancer comes to me and they say, hey, Rachel, I really want to follow a keto diet, I'm going to say, listen, I understand why. I understand your intent and I understand your perspective. And I'm not going to dismiss that. I'm not going to dismiss that idea or that feeling or that reason why they want to do this. But I'm also going to teach them that there could be another way to fueling their body. There could be another way to getting what they want, getting what they need, as long as it's a realistic goal,
Mhm.
but it doesn't have to involve one of these restrictive types of diet. So, to answer your question, generally, I'm never encouraging any type of diet. I definitely have an anti-diet approach. I'm a counselor of intuitive eating, so I'm teaching my clients how to fuel their body intuitively. I am also utilizing those principles of sports nutrition to make sure they know how to fuel for their performance. But if they're coming to me and they're saying, I read about intermittent fasting and I really want to try it out, well, I'm going to educate them about why that's probably not the best idea. Give them the tools, take into account their intentions for that. And we'll talk about that. We'll bring all of that to the table. But at the end of the day, I want them to realize what's going to allow them to perform sustainably long term. And I can give them multiple sources of research as to why several of these, or if not all of these different diets or whatever diet they're coming to me with, is not going to support them long term.
So Rachel, how did you become so passionate about dance nutrition?
It's a great question. So I've been a dancer my whole life, and growing up, I actually always had a very balanced look at food. I will say that in of itself comes from a place of privilege in regards to I just grew up, in a household where we had very balanced dinners every night, balanced meals. My lunches at school were pretty balanced. I never had to double think what I was eating. I also feel and recognize that even that comes from a place of having thin privilege. And just if we think about the idea of me being in a body that is quote unquote accepted in our society, means that I never had anybody saying, oh no, you shouldn't eat that, or maybe you should be
Ah,
careful with that. Does that
yeah.
make sense? I came from a place of privilege when I say that. Well, I grew up, I had this a pretty quote unquote healthy, balanced outlook on fueling my body. It wasn't until I started dancing more seriously, I should say, at the age of like 15, 16, when I started to question, well, the foods I'm putting in my body are probably going to impact my performance. So I just got very into healthy eating.
Mm.
And again, that intent came from a very good place. My intent was that I just wanted to perfect my performance. I'm a typical type A perfectionist. And I felt that, if I can quote unquote perfect my plate, then I could perfect my performance. And that's where I fell into behaviors of quote unquote clean eating,
Mm.
or what can be considered as orthorexia, which isn't even an official diagnosis in the DSM, but it is very debilitating and very limiting. Lucky for me, though, I was was able to see these habits as being very unsustainable. I was able to kind of like look at myself in the mirror and being like, okay, this isn't going to work long term. I think I was like 4 months into like this idea of clean eating. And I was like, this is not going to work long term because, again, I just came from a family that really took a lot of pride in food. Every family celebration was going out to a delicious restaurant or just getting together with my cousins,
Mhm.
and food played a huge role in my family.
Yeah.
And because my clean eating diet, took that away from me, it just wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work long
Right.
term.
Right.
And I saw that and I experienced that thankfully very quickly. It didn't lead me
Mm.
down any road of an official, I
Sure.
should say, quote unquote, official diagnosed eating disorder. And I was like, you know what? I need to learn. I need to really figure out what this means to fuel my body in a balanced way. And that's when I actually started studying nutrition and getting into dietetics. From there, changing majors. I was a dance major in college, ended up changing majors to a nutrition, wanting to pursue my RD, my license. I got very into actually clinical nutrition. And I even worked in a hospital for a couple of years, but I always wanted to apply everything I've learned to dancers. I was always interested in performance nutrition and sports nutrition. So eventually got my license, got my RD while I was working in the hospital, picked up a couple dancers here and there to work with one-on-one, picked up a couple contracts with companies and some schools in New York City, and just to give them nutrition workshops. And just over time started building that up more until I was able to just leave my job at the hospital and work solely with dancers, which is obviously brings me to where I am now. But I will say, even after my schooling to be a dietitian, it wasn't until afterwards that I really started to dig into this idea of intuitive eating and eventually getting my certification as a counselor of intuitive eating and wanting to fuse this idea of performance nutrition with intuitive nutrition. Because again, there was always that factor that I would think back on. It's like, we can fuel our bodies with quote unquote healthy foods, but does that mean we're eating from a place of enjoyment? Because like I said, growing up for me, food was a huge part of my family's culture. And it was just we took a lot of pride in our food. And I want to show dancers that it's okay to do that they don't have to feel, shameful or guilty, that they can actually love food and still be a professional dancer. I think there's just a lot of connotations out there, about dancers having to be on a quote unquote diet. And I just want to change that. Dancers can take just as much pride in their food as anyone else can.
Amazing. And they're so grateful to have you, as a
Thank you.
resource. So do you have any exciting projects on the forefront?
That's a good question. I'm usually always working on something. Right now, my mind's always kind of working on like what I can do next. Right now, I would say my biggest thing is just continuing to roll out content for dancenutrition.com. I just love writing and I love diving into different topics on my website. So for the rest of 2021, I'm really focusing on my website, dancenutrition.com, getting out content to dancers in that way. I have a lot going on in regards to just, having a baby 5 months
Mhm.
ago. I
Yeah.
have my son also, who's a toddler. So in regards to just me practicing what I preach, I have a little bit of self-compassion and I sometimes have to take 2 steps back in order to take a step forward. So right now I'm kind of just capping it at dancenutrition.com. And I believe in 2022 is when I will start back up again with my own podcast and wanting to get some more interviews on there. I do have an Instagram live series that I do. I have a couple really exciting people that are coming on. By the time your podcast airs, it's already going to be on. But Evelyn Tremblay is the founder, or the author, I should say, co-author of the book Intuitive Eating.
Awesome.
So that's going to be a really great interview that I would just recommend anyone listen to.
Very nice. Any final tips, recommendations that you want to give?
No, I think everything you're doing is fabulous. Just getting all of this information out to dancers is just so important and so wonderful. The most I can say is that dancers should realize as much as performance nutrition is important, so is building a connection with food. And I think this idea of quote unquote emotional eating is culturally constructed to have a very negative connotation to it. But I want dancers to realize that food should have a positive emotional response, and it's meant to. And they can build a lifestyle that really encompasses having this this positive relationship with food.
Beautiful. Thank you. And thank you everyone for tuning into the Know and Do Better podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to like and follow us wherever you find your podcasts. You can also follow Inspira Physical Therapy and Pilates on Instagram at Inspira Physical Therapy and check out our website, inspirapt.com. Be sure to stay tuned for our next episode.